It was late evening when the storm rolled across the city skyline, lightning splitting the sky over the towering glass building of the Stanton Corporation. The marble floors gleamed, but in the quiet of the vast lobby, the hum of the cleaning cart was the only sound. A tall, weary black man named Marcus pushed it forward, his shoulders heavy with more than just the weight of a mop and bucket. His eyes held the tired determination of someone who had been underestimated his whole life. He was the new cleaner, hired only a week ago, and already the whispers of the other staff had reached him, dismissive comments, laughter behind his back, remarks about how he was lucky to even get this job. Marcus didn't respond. He kept his head down, his mind elsewhere, as though carrying a story no one bothered to ask about. High above the lobby, in the penthouse office, the millionaire boss himself, Richard Stanton, sat behind a wide mahogany desk, staring at a photograph. It was of his two children, identical twins with bright smiles, at least in the picture. In reality, their lives were far more complicated. Emily and Ethan, 7 years old, had been born deaf. Their mother had left years ago, unable to handle the challenges of raising them, leaving Richard to provide everything money could buy. He hired therapists, bought the latest devices, filled the house with teachers and caretakers. But no matter how much he spent, he felt the same crushing helplessness every night when his children looked at him with eyes that seemed to ask for something deeper, something he didn't know how to give. Marcus was scrubbing the lobby floor. When he first saw them, a soft giggle-eyed playful echoed down the stairwell, though not in the way most children's laughter did. Emily and Ethan appeared, running ahead of their nanny, using hand signs rapidly between them, their faces full of animation. The nanny scolded them half-heartedly, but Marcus paused, his mop mid-air, his eyes softening as he watched them. For a moment, the tiredness in his expression shifted to something else: recognition. He knew the language of their hands. He had seen it before, lived it before. His sister, long ago, had been born deaf, and in a small house on the other side of the city, a young Marcus had taught himself every gesture, every movement, just to speak to her, just to let her know she wasn't alone. Emily dropped her toy, and it rolled across the polished marble toward Marcus's bucket. He bent down, picked it up, and held it out to her. But instead of just smiling, he lifted his free hand and signed, careful and gentle. "You dropped this." The nanny froze. Emily's eyes widened. Ethan stopped moving, his little hands clutched against his chest. Slowly, Emily signed back, "You know how to talk like us." Marcus smiled softly, nodding, "Yes, I do." For a moment silence filled the massive lobby, except for the storm outside. Emily reached for the toy, but her gaze stayed fixed on Marcus, her small hands fluttering in excitement to her brother. Ethan stepped closer, staring at Marcus as though he had just seen magic. Their nanny pulled them back quickly. "Come on, children, don't bother the cleaner," she said sharply, shooting Marcus a look of warning. But the twins didn't stop. As they were led away, Ethan turned around and signed boldly, "Come back tomorrow." Marcus signed back, quickly but discreetly, "I'll be here." That night, in his tiny apartment on the far side of town, Marcus lay awake on a thin mattress. The rain drummed against the roof as he thought of the children's faces, the way their eyes had lit up when someone had finally spoken to them in their language. He thought of his sister, long gone, taken too soon by an illness they couldn't afford to treat. He thought of the promise he had made to himself, that one day he would use what he had learned, use the patience and love he had carried for her, to help someone else. And now, fate had placed two children in front of him who needed exactly that. The next day, Richard Stanton stormed through the lobby with his assistant, his voice sharp. "I don't care what it costs, I want results. Do you understand me? Results. My kids are falling behind, and I won't accept excuses." He barely glanced at Marcus as he passed. Marcus kept his head down, but inside, a thought burned. Your money won't give them what they need. What they need is time. What they need is love. Later that afternoon, Emily and Ethan sneaked away from their nanny and found Marcus in a quiet hallway, where he was polishing the brass railings. They tugged at his sleeve, their small faces glowing with mischief and hope. Marcus looked around, making sure no one saw, then crouched down to their level. They signed eagerly, fast and clumsy, but full of joy. "Will you teach us more?" He hesitated. If he was caught, he could lose his job. But looking into their faces, he knew he couldn't say no. He began slowly, teaching them signs for words they didn't know yet, making them repeat until they got it right, laughing silently with them when they made mistakes. For the first time in their lives, someone was meeting them where they were, not trying to force them into a world they couldn't hear, but stepping into their world, and that was how it began. Days turned into weeks. Marcus worked in the shadows, scrubbing floors, wiping windows, polishing marble, all while secretly teaching the twins whenever he had a chance. The children grew bolder, sneaking down hallways to find him, practicing signs in the corners of the grand lobby, their laughter filling the silent spaces of their world. Marcus taught them not just words, but stories his sister used to love fables he had shaped into gestures, bringing life into their hands. The children's eyes shone brighter with each passing day, and for the first time, their nanny noticed something strange. They were smiling more, understanding more, eager in a way she had never seen before. But secrets never last forever. One evening Richard arrived home early. He entered the grand hall just as Marcus was kneeling with the twins, their hands moving quickly, their faces glowing with delight. Richard froze, watching from the shadows. He didn't understand what they were doing, but he saw the joy, the connection, the way his children looked at this janitor, this man he barely noticed. His jaw tightened. Why did they look at him like that? Why hadn't they ever looked at him that way? The nanny rushed in, flustered. "Sir, this is not what it looks like. I'll make sure it stops immediately." But Richard didn't speak. He only turned and walked away, his face unreadable. That night, Marcus was called into the office. Richard sat behind his massive desk, the city lights blazing behind him. His voice was cold. "You're a cleaner. You clean. That is all. Do not involve yourself with my children again. Do you understand?" Marcus's chest tightened. He wanted to explain, to tell him what his children needed, but the power in Richard's eyes warned him. This man could crush his life with a word, so he nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." But as he left, he thought of Emily and Ethan, and he knew the story wasn't over, because some connections can't be silenced. Marcus returned to the lobby the next morning, his mop in hand, but his spirit heavier than usual. The words from Richard still echoed in his head. "You're a cleaner. You clean. That is all." He had heard versions of that his entire life, from teachers who never believed in him, from managers who dismissed him, from neighbors who whispered, behind closed doors. No, it came from the man who controlled his paycheck, the man who could snatch away the only chance Marcus had to provide for his daughter back home. Because yes, what no one in that marble tower knew was that Marcus had a little girl of his own, 7 years old, living with her grandmother miles away. Her name was Grace, and she was his reason for breathing. Every dollar he earned here went to her school shoes, her food, her safety. He could not risk losing this job. But when he lifted his eyes and saw Emily and Ethan watching him from the balcony above, their little hands frozen mid-sign, he felt torn. They looked down at him not as a cleaner, not as someone beneath them, but as someone who finally understood. And he knew that if he turned away now, he would be betraying more than himself. He would be betraying them too. That afternoon, Emily slipped into the hall where Marcus polished the brass railings. Her nanny was distracted with a phone call. She tugged on his sleeve and signed quickly, urgently. "Why didn't you talk to us today? Did we do something wrong?" Marcus swallowed hard, glancing around nervously. "No," he signed back. "You did nothing wrong. Your father told me I can't talk to you anymore." Her eyes filled with tears. Ethan appeared behind her, his fists clenched, his small face red with frustration. "That's not fair," he signed. "You're the only one who understands us." Marcus's chest ached. He reached out hesitating, then gently signed back. "Sometimes life isn't fair, but we have to be strong anyway." Emily's tears spilled over. She clutched his arm tightly and shook her head. "Please don't stop," she begged in trembling hands. And in that moment, Marcus knew the decision had already been made. He couldn't stop, even if it cost him everything. The twins began sneaking to him in secret. At first, just for a few minutes at a time, then longer stretches when the nanny was busy, or when Richard was away. Marcus taught them not just language but songs his sister had loved, translated into graceful hand movements, where rhythm lived not in sound but in motion. The children laughed silently, their small hands dancing through the air like birds finally freed from cages. One evening Richard returned earlier than expected. He walked into the study to find his children performing one of those signed songs for Marcus, their eyes shining with joy. Marcus froze. The twins kept going, unaware of their father's presence, their hands moving in rhythm, their smiles wide. Richard's face hardened. He stepped forward sharply. "Enough!" His voice thundered through the room. Emily and Ethan stopped instantly, their smiles vanishing. Marcus rose slowly, his head bowed. Richard's gaze burned into him. "Did I not make myself clear? You are done. Pack your things and get out." The twins erupted into panic. Emily ran forward, tugging at her father's sleeve, signing furiously. Ethan joined her, both of them pleading with wide eyes. Richard frowned in confusion, unable to understand their desperate gestures. He looked helplessly at the nanny. "What are they saying?" the nanny stammered. "They're begging you not to fire him, sir. They don't want him to go." Richard's jaw tightened. His children clung to him, their little hands flying, their tears spilling. For the first time in his life, he realized something brutal. His wealth, his power, his empire of it mattered in this moment. He could not understand his own children, and this cleaner, this man he had dismissed as nothing, could, but pride is a stubborn master. Richard tore his children's hands gently away. "Enough," he said coldly. "Both of you, upstairs." The children resisted, sobbing silently, but the nanny guided them away. Richard turned back to Marcus, his voice low and venomous. "Get out of my house before I have security escort. You." Marcus clenched his jaw, but he didn't fight back. He gathered his few belongings from the small janitor's closet and left the mansion that night, his heart heavy, his future uncertain. But fate had a way of weaving threads no man could control. The very next day, Ethan wandered into the driveway as a delivery truck backed up too quickly. Emily screamed silently, waving her hands frantically, but the nanny was nowhere in sight. Marcus, who had come to collect his final paycheck, saw the danger from across the street. Without a thought, he sprinted, his boots pounding the pavement, his voice erupting in a roar that split the air. He leaped forward, snatching Ethan into his arms and rolling across the gravel just as the truck screeched to a halt. Emily's eyes were wide with terror, then relief as she ran to her brother's side. Ethan clung to Marcus, trembling but safe. Richard came storming out, his face pale as he took in the scene. "What happened?" he shouted. The driver stammered an apology. Emily pointed at Marcus, her hands flying. Ethan did the same, signing furiously, their motions frantic and desperate. "He saved me. He saved me." Richard stared at Marcus, his chest heaving. For the first time, his voice faltered. You saved my son." Marcus met his eyes steadily. Any father would have done the same. The twins clung to Marcus, refusing to let go. In that moment, something cracked inside Richard's heart. He saw his children's love, their need, their bond with this man he had tried to erase. Saw the truth he had been blind to. Money could not buy what Marcus had given them. Trust, understanding, connection. But pride still pulled at him, and power still wrapped around his voice. "We'll discuss this later," he muttered, retreating back into the mansion. That night, Richard stood in his study, staring again at the photograph of his children. For years he had tried to control everything with money, with power, with fear. But in one single evening, a cleaner had shown him that he knew his children better than he ever had. Richard poured himself a glass of whiskey, but his hand trembled as he lifted it. For the first time in decades, Richard Stanton felt something unfamiliar: shame. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his apartment, holding a worn photograph of his daughter Grace. He whispered into the quiet, "I don't know what tomorrow will bring, baby girl, but I won't stop fighting." And as the storm rolled back into the city, Marcus didn't know that his fight with Richard Stanton was only just beginning, because what had started as a secret bond with two children was about to ignite a war of pride, power, and love that neither man could walk away from. Marcus came to work the next morning carrying the weight of silence on his shoulders. He had kept his promise to Richard the night before. He had agreed not to involve himself with the twins again, but promises made under threats had a way of bruising the heart. As he polished the marble floor, he could still see Emily's pleading hands in his mind, the way her fingers had flown desperately, asking him not to leave them. He could still feel the tremble in Ethan's small hands as the boy had clung to him, eyes wide with fear at the thought of losing their only bridge to the world. The lobby was unusually quiet. Even the other staff whispered less when he walked past. The nanny kept her eyes on him, sharper than usual, as though she had been ordered to watch his every move. Marcus didn't need confirmation. He knew Richard's kinder-wealthy who believed they owned not only buildings and businesses, but people too, and if Richard had said to stay away from his children, he meant it with the kind of cold finality that ended careers. Still, as Marcus turned the corner near the grand staircase, he caught sight of two familiar faces peeking between the railings. Emily and Ethan, their cheeks flushed with nervousness, their eyes wide with hope. They ducked back quickly, but not before Marcus lifted his hand subtly, just enough to sign a single word. Later, the children's eyes lit up, and for the first time that day, Marcus felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. When later came, it wasn't in the lobby or the grand hall where cameras and staff could icily catch them. It was in the dim storage corridor behind the kitchen where the scent of spices hung in the air and the hum of freezers masked their whispers. Emily tugged Marcus by the sleeve, her brother close behind. They signed rapidly, their hands trembling. With urgency, why are you avoiding us? Emily demanded with her little hands. Marcus crouched down, lowering his voice as though even sound might betray him. Because your father told me I have to, he signed slowly. Ethan's face twisted. In anger, he doesn't understand. You do, he doesn't even try. Marcus sighed. He loves you, but sometimes love gets lost in pride. Emily shook her head. If he loved us, he would listen. Marcus's throat tightened. How could he explain to two children that sometimes even parents built walls too tall for love to climb? Instead, he reached out and signed gently. You are not alone. As long as I am here, I will find a way. The children smiled, but their smiles were fragile, like glass that could shatter with one harsh word. Days passed like this, small, stolen moments behind hallways, rushed lessons in corners of the garden while the nanny's back was turned. Marcus taught them new signs, not just words, but feelings, courage, hope, patience. He told them stories with his hands, fables where heroes looked like them, where being different was not a weakness but a gift. One afternoon, as they sat in a quiet alcove, Emily signed with excitement. Show us a secret word. Something only we will know. Marcus thought for a moment, then formed a gesture with his hands, crossing his arms, touching his heart, then opening them outward like wings. This means stronger together. It's ours. The twins repeated it eagerly, giggling silently. Their hands moving in perfect sync, they signed it to each other, then back to Marcus, a pact of trust sealed in motion. But secrets, no matter how carefully kept, have a way of slipping into the open. Richard Stanton was a man who built his empire on control, and lately he had felt it slipping. Board meetings ended with questions he couldn't answer. Shareholders whispered about his children's progress, hinting that perhaps his family's weakness made him unfit to lead with vision. Each whisper fueled his fury, and when he returned home at night, that fury turned into suspicion. He noticed the subtle changes in his twins, the way they smiled more, gestured more confidently, carried themselves with pride he hadn't seen before. He should have been proud. Instead, he felt threatened. One evening, Richard returned earlier than expected and stopped in the shadow of the study door. Inside, he saw his children laughing silently as Marcus signed a story. They were mimicking him, their faces bright, their movements fluid, their joy undeniable. Richard's fists clenched. He saw connection. He saw understanding. But worst of all, he saw something he did not share. When the moment ended, he stepped into the room, his voice like a whip. What is going on here? Emily froze. Ethan's hands dropped mid-motion. Marcus rose slowly, his expression steady but his pulse racing. Sir, you were just disobeying me, Richard snapped. I gave you one instruction, and you couldn't even follow that. He turned on his children. Upstairs. Now, the twins burst into frantic motion, signing furiously, tears welling in their eyes. Their hands flew with desperate speed. Don't take him away. He helps us, he understands. Richard's face darkened. He looked at the nanny. What are they saying? The nanny hesitated, her voice trembling. They're asking you not to send him away. They're saying, he's the only one who understands them. For a moment, something flickered across Richard's face, pain, regret, but it vanished quickly beneath the steel of pride. Enough, he barked. He pointed at Marcus. You're finished here. Pack your things. Emily and Ethan erupted into silent sobs, their small hands pounding against their father's chest, begging him in the only language they knew. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes cold. He pulled them away and handed them to the nanny. Take them upstairs. Marcus stood in silence, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to fight back, to tell Richard he was destroying the very connection his children needed. But the look in Richard's eyes warned him. This was not a man who listened. This was a man who commanded. That night, Marcus packed the few belongings he kept in the janitor's closet: a spare shirt, a small Bible, and the photograph of his daughter Grace. He walked out of the mansion, with his head held high, but inside, his heart broke for the children he was leaving behind. He thought it was the end, but life had other plans. The next day, Marcus returned briefly to collect his final paycheck. He stood outside the gates, waiting for the accountant to bring the envelope. The mansion grounds were busy, staff moving in and out, cars pulling into the driveway. That was when he saw Ethan. The boy had slipped away from the nanny's watch, chasing a small toy car that rolled into the path of a delivery truck. The truck's engine roared as it reversed, the driver blind to the child behind him. Emily screamed silently from the steps, waving her arms frantically, but no one understood her gestures. No one except Marcus. Without thinking, Marcus dropped his envelope and sprinted. His boots pounded the gravel, his voice tearing through the air. Stop! Stop! He dove forward, scooping Ethan into his arms, rolling across the driveway just as the truck screeched to a halt, its tires inches from crushing them both. The world froze. Emily ran down the steps, her face pale with terror, and threw her arms around her brother. Ethan clung to Marcus, shaking but alive. Staff rushed forward, murmuring in shock. Richard appeared at the door, his face white as chalk. "What happened?" he barked. The driver stammered apologies. Emily pointed at Marcus, her hands flying with desperate speed. Ethan did the same, his motions frantic. "He saved me. It saved me." Richard's eyes locked on Marcus. For the first time, the millionaire had no words. Marcus rose slowly, still holding Ethan until the boy's shaking stopped. Then he gently set him down and met Richard's gaze. His voice was calm, steady. Any father would have done the same. The twins clung to Marcus, refusing to let go. Their tears soaked into his shirt as their little hands signed over and over. "Don't leave us. Please don't leave us." Richard stood frozen in the doorway, torn between pride and something he had buried long ago. Gratitude. His empire had taught him that everything had a price, that people could be bought, dismissed, or replaced. But in this moment, staring at the man who had just saved his son's life, Richard realized the truth he had been running from. Not everything could be controlled. Not everything could be purchased. And yet, even as his heart wavered, his pride dug its claws deeper. "We'll discuss this later," he muttered, turning sharply back into the mansion. Marcus watched him go, his jaw tight. He knew this wasn't over. That night, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the family portrait on his desk. For years he had fought battles in boardrooms, won wars with contracts, crushed rivals with money. But here, in the silence of his home, he realized he was losing the most important fight of all, the fight to know his own children. And the man he had dismissed as nothing had just shown him how far behind he really was. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his small apartment, the envelope of wages unopened on the table. He held the photograph of Grace in his hands, whispering into the quiet, "I don't know how long they'll let me stay near them, baby girl, but I swear I won't stop fighting for what's right." Outside, the storm rumbled again across the city skyline. And deep inside the Stanton mansion, two children lay awake, whispering with their hands in the dark, signing the secret gesture Marcus had given them. Stronger together, stronger together, stronger together. They believed it. But they didn't yet know how much their world was about to change. The morning after the accident, the Stanton mansion was unusually quiet. Staff whispered in corners, the air thick with the weight of what had happened. News of Marcus saving Ethan had already spread among the workers. And while some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered with admiration. A few even looked at Marcus differently when he arrived to collect what he thought would be his final pay. But he knew better than to mistake whispers for change. Richard Stanton, however, had not spoken a word to him since the incident. He had retreated into his office, the heavy oak door closed, phone calls muted. The man who controlled billion-dollar deals now found himself unable to control the most important truths staring him in the face. A cleaner had reached his children in ways he never had. Emily and Ethan refused to eat breakfast that morning. They sat stubbornly at the long dining table, their arms folded, their eyes red from crying the night before. Their nanny tried coaxing them with pancakes and syrup, but they shook their heads violently, signing furiously at her. She sighed, helplessly. "They want Marcus," she muttered, her voice trembling when Richard entered the room. He stopped in his tracks. His children looked up at him, their small hands moving with rapid intensity. He didn't understand a single word. Their gestures looked like chaos to him, a blur of motions, but the desperation on their faces was unmistakable. "They're asking for him again," the nanny said softly. Richard's jaw tightened. "Enough," he snapped. "They need discipline, not dependency." Emily slammed her tiny fists against the table, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ethan shoved his plate away, his face crumpling. They stormed from the table, running up the stairs, their sobs silent but louder than any scream Richard had ever heard. For the first time, he felt powerless. Later that day, Marcus was called back to the mansion not by Richard, but by the twins themselves. They had slipped away from their nanny again and found him in the garden, where he sat quietly on a bench, debating whether he should walk away from this place forever. Emily ran straight to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. Ethan followed, clutching Marcus's sleeve. Their hands moved rapidly, their signs full of urgency. "Don't leave us, please, promise." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He signed back slowly. I don't know if your father will allow it. He doesn't want me near you. Ethan's face darkened. Then we'll fight him. Marcus shook his head. No, he is your father. Fighting him will only hurt you more. But listen to me, you are strong. Stronger than you know. You don't need me forever. You already have the power inside you. But Emily shook her head furiously. We need you. You make us feel real. Those words struck Marcus deeper than any insult or command Richard had thrown at him. Real, that was what the world had denied them. What their own father, blinded by pride, had failed to give them. Before Marcus could respond, a shadow fell across the garden. Richard stood there, his face carved from stone. Inside, he commanded his children. Emily and Ethan froze, clinging tighter to Marcus. I said now, Richard repeated, his voice sharp as a blade. The nanny rushed forward, her voice trembling. Come on, children, let's go. But they refused. Emily's hands flew in a blur of frantic signs. Ethan's followed, their bodies shaking with defiance. The nanny translated in a whisper, they say they won't go anywhere without Marcus. Richard's chest heaved. For a long moment, he stood there, torn between rage and despair. Finally, his voice dropped low, almost trembling. Why him? Why not me? The question silenced even the birds in the garden. Marcus looked up at Richard, meeting his eyes for the first time without fear. Because you don't see them, he said softly. You see their deafness. You see what they can't do. I see who they are. That's the difference. Richard's face went pale, his pride cut deeper than any wound he had ever suffered in business. He turned sharply, his voice breaking into fury. Get out now. And this time, don't come back. Security was called. Marcus was escorted off the property, the twins screaming silently behind the gates, their small hands pounding against the iron bars as tears streamed down their faces. Marcus turned once, lifting his hands discreetly so only they could see. The secret sign, stronger together. Then he walked away, his heart breaking with every step. But the story didn't end there. That evening, Richard held a dinner at his mansion with business associates and investors. The dining hall glittered with chandeliers, the air filled with the clinking of silverware and murmurs of power. Richard needed this dinner to secure a new contract, one that would expand his empire further. Everything had to be perfect. But children don't obey the rules of business. Halfway through the evening, Emily and Ethan stormed into the hall, their eyes blazing. They marched right up to their father's table, ignoring the startled gasps of the wealthy guests. Their small hands flew. In furious gestures, their bodies trembling with rage and pain. The guests stared in confusion. What are they doing? One whispered. Why are they moving like that? They're deaf, another muttered under her breath. Richard felt his face burn with shame. He tried to shoo them away, but Emily climbed onto a chair, slamming her tiny hands on the table to demand attention. She signed wildly, her face wet with tears, her gestures fierce. Ethan joined her, their hands moving in perfect rhythm, telling a story the room could not understand. The guests murmured, awkward, uncomfortable. Richard's voice cracked with humiliation. Enough, go to your room. But Emily refused. She looked at her father with fiery eyes and signed one word over and over. Marcus. 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 The room fell into stunned silence. One guest leaned toward Richard, whispering, who was Marcus? Richard's face twisted. No one, he snapped. But Emily pointed at him furiously, her little fingers spelling out with perfect clarity. He is someone. He sees us. Though most in the room didn't understand sign language, the desperation and passion in her body spoke louder than words. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, whispers rippling through the hall. For the first time, Richard Stanton, powerful, untouchable, felt naked under the judgment of others. The nanny rushed forward, trying to pull the children away, but they resisted with all their strength, their hands flying. Ethan signed with trembling intensity. If Marcus doesn't come back, we don't want you either. The words, translated softly by the nanny, struck the room like a thunderclap. Richard's composure cracked. His hands shook as he slammed his glass onto the table. Enough, he roared. The children burst into tears, running from the room. The guests murmured in shock. The glittering image of Stanton power shattered before their eyes. That night, Richard sat alone in his study, his head in his hands. For the first time in his life, he questioned everything. Money, pride, control, none of it mattered if his own children saw him as a stranger. And the one man he had despised most had become their anchor. Miles away, Marcus sat in his apartment, staring at the unopened paycheck on the table. He had nearly decided to leave the city, to search for work elsewhere, when a soft knock echoed at his door. He opened it to find Emily and Ethan standing there, rain-soaked, shivering, their nanny behind them looking guilty and frightened. "They begged me to bring them," she whispered. "I couldn't say no." The children threw themselves into Marcus's arms, sobbing silently, their hands clinging to his shirt. Marcus held them close, his own tears mixing with the rain. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, though his heart surged with fierce joy. Emily pulled back just enough to sign, her fingers trembling. "We don't care, we need you." And in that moment, Marcus knew there was no turning back, because this fight wasn't just about a job anymore. It was about love. It was about dignity. It was about proving that no amount of pride or power could silence the truth of a bond forged in understanding. And Richard Stanton, whether he liked it or not, was about to face the one battle he couldn't win with money. The Stanton estate stood silent after the storm of humiliation that had swept through its grand halls. But silence is not peace. It was the silence of unease, of cracks forming in a kingdom built on pride. Richard Stanton had spent the night, pacing in his study, glass after glass of whiskey failing to calm him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's trembling hands pounding the table, Ethan's furious eyes spelling the name he despised most, Marcus. He wanted to believe it was a phase, that his children would forget the cleaner, that discipline would eventually erase Marcus from their hearts. But deep inside, a gnawing truth clawed at him. They would never forget the man who had given them something he never could understanding. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus's small apartment had never felt so alive. Emily and Ethan slept curled up on the couch, finally at peace, their faces soft with exhaustion. The nanny sat quietly in a chair, wringing her hands. "You know they can't stay here," she whispered. Marcus nodded, his voice heavy. "I know, but I can't turn them away either. Not when they came to me like that." The nanny's eyes welled with tears. "You don't understand, Marcus. You've done more for them in weeks than their father has in years. But Richard, he doesn't bend. He breaks anyone who stands in his way." Marcus looked down at the children, his heart aching. Then maybe it's time someone didn't break. The next morning, chaos erupted. The media had gotten hold of whispers from the dinner fiasco. Headlines flashed across social media. "Stanton twins cause scene at gala. Demand cleaner's return." Who is Marcus? The man Stanton's children refused to live without. By noon, reporters camped outside the mansion gates. Investors called with sharp questions. Richard's carefully polished empire trembled under the weight of scandal. Inside, Richard was livid. He slammed his phone onto the table. "Find him," he barked at his assistant. "Find Marcus, and end this nonsense before it destroys me." But Marcus didn't hide. That very afternoon, he walked up the marble steps of the mansion, not sneaking in through service doors this time, but standing tall at the front gate. The reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward him. "Marcus, is it true the Stanton children ran away to see you? Why do they call for you and not their father? Are you having a dispute with Mr. Stanton?" Marcus raised his hands not in surrender, but in sign language. Slowly, deliberately, he spelled out the words, "Every child deserves to be seen." The reporters went silent, their lenses zooming in as Marcus's hands moved with passion and precision. Then he spoke, his voice firm. "I didn't come here to fight a billionaire. I came here for 2 children who deserve love and respect. That's all." The clip went viral within hours. The world didn't see a cleaner anymore. They saw a man who stood unshaken before power, a man who had given a voice to children long ignored. Richard watched the broadcast from his study, fury burning through him. But as the clip replayed, something else crept in, a flicker of shame. He remembered the way Ethan had clung to Marcus, the way Emily's eyes had pleaded, desperate to be seen. He had thought his empire made him untouchable. But now he realized the truth. The entire world was watching, not his wealth, not his power, but his failure as a father. That evening, Richard summoned Marcus to the mansion, not through threats this time, but through the nanny, who delivered the message nervously. When Marcus entered the grand hall, it was not with bowed head or janitor's uniform. He came in, wearing a simple shirt and jacket, his posture straight, his gaze steady. The twins spotted him first. Their faces lit up like lanterns, and they ran to him, signing furiously. "We knew you'd come. We knew you'd fight." Richard's heart twisted. His own children had never looked at him that way. "Enough," Richard muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He turned to Marcus. "What do you want? Money, recognition, a permanent position?" Marcus shook his head. "None of that. I don't want your money. I want you to listen to them." He gestured toward Emily and Ethan. "They're not broken, Richard. They're not your shame. They're your children. And all they've ever wanted is for you to see them the way they are." The twins signed desperately to their father, their hands trembling with urgency. The nanny translated softly, tears in her eyes. "They're saying, we don't need a perfect father. We just need you to try." The words shattered the walls Richard had built around himself. His eyes burned, his hands shook, his chest heaving as though years of suppressed grief and guilt had finally broken free. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. For the first time in his life, Richard Stanton wept. The days that followed marked a transformation no one had expected. Richard hired sign language tutors not just for his children, but for himself. His hands fumbled at first, clumsy and awkward, but each night he sat with Emily and Ethan, practicing. They giggled at his mistakes, corrected him patiently, their eyes brighter than ever. And Marcus, Richard asked him to stay, not as a cleaner, but as a mentor, a bridge between him and the children. At first, Marcus hesitated. He had no desire to be tied to a mansion that had once humiliated him, but when he saw the twins' hopeful faces, he knew the choice was already made. He stayed. Months later, the Stanton estate looked different. Laughter filled its halls where silence once reigned. Emily and Ethan signed stories at dinner, their father signing back with imperfect but earnest hands. Guests who visited were greeted not just with wealth, but with warmth. And Marcus, he became more than an employee, he became family. But his impact didn't stop there. The viral clip of his words sparked national conversation about children with disabilities, about dignity, about unseen workers who often had the deepest wisdom. Organizations reached out, inviting Marcus to speak. Schools asked him to share his story. He stood on stages now, not with polished suits or rehearsed speeches, but with honesty. His message never changed. Every child deserves to be seen. Every life deserves respect. One evening, as the sun set over the Stanton Gardens, Marcus sat on the bench where it had all begun. Emily and Ethan curled up beside him, their hands busy in the air, signing stories about their day. Richard approached quietly, for once without command in his stride. He watched them for a moment, then sat down awkwardly beside Marcus. "They love you," Richard said softly. Marcus nodded. "And I love them." Richard's jaw tightened. He struggled for words, the kind he had never said before. Finally, he forced them out. "Thank you for giving me back my children." Marcus looked at him, then at the twins, their laughter glowing like light in the twilight. "No," he said gently, "you gave them back to yourself. I just helped you see what was always there." For the first time, Richard smiled, not the sharp smile of a businessman, but the soft, fragile smile of a father who had finally learned what mattered. And under the fading sky, surrounded by the soundless joy of his children, Richard Stanton knew this was the one deal worth everything.